good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Robin Wauters. I'm the founder and editor of Tech.eu, and I'm very, very delighted to welcome you today to our online FinTech conference. And even though we would have much appreciated to meet you in person, when we started planning this event back in December, the situation was very, very unclear yet, so we couldn't really make a decision to do it in person yet, which is why it's online, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll make up for that at later times. I would like to welcome also in advance all of the amazing speakers that we have for today. We have some of the leading European fintech companies and innovators joining us today, so I'm quite delighted with the lineup personally. I'm looking forward to all of the discussions that we're hosting today. Thank you again for joining. I do think it's important to acknowledge that we're living in strange times once again, not just because of COVID-19, which is still a presence worldwide, but also because of the brutal war that Russia has been waging on Ukraine for more than, well, almost 2 weeks now. So we would like to acknowledge that fact also because we have a lot of friends within the Ukrainian tech community. These people do not deserve that, so we do want to make a clear statement that we're against this war and that we hope for, like many people in the world, I assume, we hope for a very, very quick and peaceful resolution to this war so the Ukrainian people can get back to their normal lives, including our friends within the tech community. So with that out of the way, again, welcome to our FinTech event. I'm going to open this event with a presentation, share with you some data on the European FinTech industry as a whole, before we kick off the discussions. So with your permission, we can move to the initial presentation from me, sharing some data. So I would like to open with some general statistics before we move to the chart, just to give you a sense of what is happening within the European FinTech space. We looked at the data for 2021, and what we monitored was about 750 financing deals, for example, totaling almost 26 billion euros for the year, only going to fintech companies, including, of course, the UK, not just the EU, but Europe as a whole. And just to give you some context, those 26 billion euros is about the same amount that was invested in total in European technology startups in 2017, and almost the level of amount of investment that we had in 2018. So just to give you a sense of the enormity of how much fintech really weighs on the European technology industry. It's about a fourth of the total investment that we monitored for the year in 2021. And as you will see in later charts, it doesn't show any signs of slowing down just yet. So we're going to zoom in to the top 10 fintech funding rounds or fintech companies that we monitored in 2021, because some of these deals were, of course, or some of these funding amounts were, of course, across multiple deals or multiple rounds. And you can see very clearly that Klarna is leading the pack, as I'm sure is not a surprise to many of you watching. But Klarna had, across 2 or 3 deals, I think 1.5 billion euros almost invested in total, which is a huge amount considering the 26 billion euros in total going to fintech companies. It's also almost twice as much as the number 2, 26. As you can see, there's lots of the usual suspects in this ranking. WeFox, neobanks like Monzo, Revolut, N26 as well. But you can see some of these big names. Just one note, this doesn't take into account the type of funding. So we didn't really make a difference between debt funding and equity funding, just so you know. Not all of this was pure equity. And then looking from a geographical point of view, you can see that the UK still reigns extremely supreme when it comes to fintech investments in Europe, with close to 12 billion euros raised, which is almost half of the total amount of fintech investments for the full year last year, compared to number 2 Germany, which barely got to 4.5 billion euros invested in fintech. And then number 3, Sweden, didn't even break the 2 billion euro number. So you can see that the UK is really, really still quite dominant, at least when it comes to fintech funding. On the flip side, there's small nations like Switzerland and Estonia that are seeing more than 250 million euros invested into fintech for the year, which was almost unimaginable even 2 or 3 years prior to that. So you can see that even though the UK and Germany and Sweden, because of Klarna, of course, still are quite dominant in this chart, in this ranking. You can see that the smaller countries are really catching up quite quickly. Looking at the total raised compared to the total of tech funding going to European companies in 2021, you can see that the proportion varies quite wildly. But you can see that how heavily fintech funding really weighs on the total number of investments going into a country's startup ecosystem. UK, for instance, hitting almost a third of the total amount of tech funding, which is a very little surprise. But as you can see, in most countries, the fintech proportion isn't that high. It ranges from 5 to 1/5 or 1/10 of the total investment going to fintech. These are the investors that have the biggest amount of participation in venture capital deals going into fintech companies. You can see all the big dogs, especially also the American like Thrive Global, Tiger Global, of course, they're everywhere, Cotu, Goldman Sachs, but also the European growth venture funds like Eurazeo, Axelis, of course, there, EQT, Creandum. So you can see it's relatively comparable to the overall tech funding space. So looking at the monthly, which isn't terribly important because, of course, this is looking at the announcements that were made, not necessarily the deals that were closed. But it's quite interesting to note that on a monthly basis, the numbers vary quite wildly. From 600 million euros roughly in February 2021, going up to almost 4 billion in June, at least when it comes to announcements. So that gives you some idea of how the fintech funding is sort of spread on a monthly basis. Looking at exits, of course, also quite important. It's important to note that we tracked about 120 exit announcements at least, merger and acquisition, IPOs and SPACs included. But only about 30 of them were disclosed in numbers. So it's very, very difficult to sort of talk about the total size of the exit environment in European fintech space, unfortunately. But from those 30 exits that had the amount disclosed, the total size was about 8 billion euros, close to 8 billion euros. You can see that the UK is quite dominant here as well. Most exits happen in the UK, 28 compared to 20 in Germany. And you can also see that most companies acquiring other European fintech companies were also based in the UK, 33 compared to 15 in Germany. So that's a bit of statistics also per month, which again doesn't really paint a full picture compared to yearly statistics. You can find all of this information in an article that we published on Tech.eu a few days ago. But I'm also quite happy to share this presentation if needed with all participants of the conference. And we will also record all the sessions of today's discussions, which you're very, very welcome to watch afterwards as well. So without further ado, let's move on to discussions. Quite delighted to have an opening with something that I'm personally quite interested in, which is the revenue-based financing or the alternative financing for startups and any SME actually in Europe that are popping up quite all over the place, I would say. And leading this discussion is going to be, my apologies, I think I left out some interesting data there. So maybe just to go back to the presentation really quickly. My apologies. I forgot to mention that we have a very, very supercharged start of the year already. So there's no signs of slowing down, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation. 68 rounds in January 2022 compared to 58 in January last year. Number of deals also in February almost doubled. And as you can see, that pace is not slowing down whatsoever. And you can see the total amount is almost 5.7 billion euros in total already invested in fintech companies in the first 2 months of this year. So quite a rapid pace already from the beginning. So we're going to keep on tracking, of course, the fintech funding. And the same goes for M&A deals, especially in February. They're quite a lot compared to February last year.